and so and so people like me, in fact, are who represented the first wave of sexual radicalism are totally out on the outside. I mean, I have my own personal history with that. Are you got this thing on now, or what?
I'm doing a test.
Yeah, all right, okay.
Yeah, it's not I haven't started. Because, I need your questions, so.
I don't think it's going to go exactly the way you hope it will, but.
Well, feel free, Jearld, that if you take a question and I put the question to you and say I use the word identity politics, feel free to say, well, my talk on that is, and take the direction you want it to go.
Yeah,
That's okay to do
right.
that.
Yeah, okay.
Because honestly, we're not using the question.
I'm getting cut out of this.
So if you
anyway.
say something that's totally out of context to the question, it doesn't matter.
All right.
So long as it fits.
All right. Okay. So let's start.
Okay, but if I start, I need to know which questions to ask you.
Well, we're going to start with the opening, and after the opening, we'll stop for a minute, and then we'll decide what to do next, I guess. I mean, we can go to talk about history and how I might see gay history. If you want something to segue into, then we can do that.
Okay.
But talking about dissension and identity politics is sort of it's all interconnected. So, anyway, all right. See how it goes.
Okay, so
here, take this.
let me just.
Okay. All right.
From just chatting with you today, though, if it's of any help, your knowledge, your experience in the movement, and how you contributed, it is very much based in that kind of what I've been calling first wave, that kind of period of time here in Toronto.
Yeah. Okay.
And that's what I'm getting from you, that you would have something to contribute in that area. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Okay. Because it may help then if I can kind of pull questions from that area so that you're more comfortable speaking.
Yeah, you as we talk, you might questions will come into your mind naturally, I think. I hope. All right.
Yeah, and that's the other thing. This is not completely scripted. Based on your response, you may trigger me a question that's not on the page, right?
That's what I'm saying.
And that keeps the conversation going. Exactly.
Exactly. All right.
I've already mentioned to Jearld, and he may not do this, but if he could work in the question and its answer, but we can work with that too. Because that way we can narrate this.
And you don't have to repeat the question if you just want to mention parts there.
Yeah. All right.
Okay. That's fine.
All right. So. We're ready to start? Okay, so why don't we do that? So basically, even though it's not even on the page, we're just asking everyone to kind of state their name and what they did within the movement. I mean, people are saying, well, I was an artist, or I am an artist, or I'm an activist.
Okay.
So we'll start with that introduction. Just introduce yourself. And
Are we on now?
Yep. Whenever you're ready to start.
Okay. Yeah, my name is Jearld Moldenhauer, and I just had my 65th birthday. And most of my life, from around the age of 20, 21 on, I was involved as an organizer of many early gay organizations. And my main career for 30 years was as a gay bookseller, an international gay bookseller. I started and ran the two Glad Day bookshops, one in Toronto here and the other one in Boston. And I retired in the year 2000. So, but my gay activism predates Stonewall. I came out in around 1965, and in 1967 I started becoming radicalized and was inspired by a student at Columbia University, who founded the first gay students organization in the United States, which I read about in the New York Times. And so I had the idea to start a similar organization at Cornell University, where I was an undergrad. So so that happened in '68, and I graduated in December '69 and went looking for a job. Ended up getting a job at the University of Toronto in the medical sciences department. And so I moved to Canada and spent about 8 months learning about Canadian society and politics. And then in the fall of '69, I founded the University of Toronto Homophile Association, for which I was fired by the University of Toronto. And I left Toronto, never intending to return. And I went off on my first travel adventure. I went to Europe with a backpack and spent nearly a year hitchhiking all around Western Europe and through Turkey and through several of the then communist East European countries. I settled in Berlin. I got my papers and had a job, and then received a telegram saying my father, who was just about 40, had suddenly died. And for better or for worse, I went back for the funeral, and I didn't have any money to return to my life in Germany. So I ended up coming back to Toronto. And the University of Toronto Homophile Association had grown. It was the only show in town, and so it had just grown enormously. And I started attending meetings again, getting involved, and I was thinking of other projects to initiate in the gay movement. I found another similar medical research job at Toronto Western Hospital. And so the first project I started in the fall of 1970 was the Glad Day Bookshop. Well, Glad Day Bookshop went several years without having an actual shop. I had come out through reading. You know, I think I came out initially by reading various French authors that were popular among young gay intellectuals, primarily André Gide and Jean Genet. And I had developed a political philosophy rooted in the works of Herbert Marcuse and Norman O. Brown, who were considered the main thinkers of the counterculture movement of the 70s in the United States. So after Stonewall in New York in June of '69, a year after Stonewall, a whole new literature of homosexuality started to appear, which I was aware of because I read the New York Times and the book reviews. And most of the books in that year, 1970, on the fall list of 1970, were personal memoirs of written by activists who had been involved in Stonewall and the first year of the gay liberation. And I went around to Toronto's bookstores looking for the books and couldn't find any of them. All the Toronto bookstores, and Toronto is a book city, you know, famous for its bookstores, at least then. The only thing they had on homosexuality were homosexuality as a disease, and psychiatric books, which were still popular at the time, that was the entire perspective on homosexuality. And none of these bookstores, even though Toronto is the book distribution center of the country, and they would have easy access to these books, this new literature, none of the bookstores ordered any of the books. And this really made me very angry. And so I investigated. I had no intentions on becoming a businessman or a bookseller, but I investigated and found out that it really wasn't that difficult to order some of the books. And you just had to fork out a little money and set up an account. It was easy in those days. So that's what I did. I ordered various of the new literature that was coming out, plus some of the classics that had been important to me, like Plato's Symposium or something like that, and put them in a backpack and started going around to the gay meetings. Well, I mean, I was in, okay, I went back to UTHA, and then George Hislop finally broke away from UTHA with the people we would call the townies. That is, most of the people who were going to the UTHA meetings, I would say, were not affiliated with the University of Toronto. They were people from the larger gay community of Toronto, because there was nothing else happening. More and more people from the general population of the city started going to those meetings. And finally, George decided to start his own organization, the CHATS, Community Homophile Association of Toronto. So then we had the second organization, and then there was another flashpoint of sorts. Some of the younger activists wanted to put together a demonstration in Ottawa where we would present to the federal government a list of demands relating to various inequality issues in law and that sort of thing. And CHAT officially would not endorse the demonstration. George had no problem with it, and he went to the demonstration along with a few of the people in CHAT, but the organization itself was too conservative. So we were all a part of CHAT, we were all a part of UTHA, but the younger activists said if we wanted to be involved in real political activism, we'd have to start our own group. So we continued being members of CHAT, and some of us continued being members of UTHA, but then we went and we formed Toronto Gay Action, which was purely this action-oriented group. At first we did what seemed kind of funny actions, like what we called zaps. We would go into a straight bar and start dancing. And or we'd have kiss-ins, that sort of thing, to try and freak out people.
Can you identify the year that those zaps happened, or the years that you were doing?
Well, I mean, they all happened in either in late 70 or 71, because
around the time of the we.
Well, yeah, you see, the march, that was the finale in a way of Toronto Gay Action. I mean, that was all building up to that. So during the winter of 71 and the spring and the early summer, that's when all these zaps occurred. I have photographs of it all. I mean, I was the photographer of that era. And so, you know, I have a few hundred pictures of all the activities that we were involved in. And so we went to Ottawa. I was in charge of making the signs, and I didn't understand much about making signs, so we made signs that couldn't withstand the downpour of rain, so most of them just completely melted. And I was the photographer. I had a movie camera. I took an 8mm movie of the march, which nobody's seen, and I took still photos as well. And
Just for clarity, the march being the one in Ottawa?
Yeah,
The
yeah,
men's,
yeah.
even though it's not called that, it wasn't called that
We would
71.
love to have.
Yeah,
some
that's
footage,
amazing
but,
stuff.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a story there too. There's plenty of stories about why no one has seen anything. I mean, no one has seen. Well, I mean, you just saw the extra article, right, where about the Ottawa march, and they used my photographs, but they didn't give me any credit. That's Ken Popert, right? Finally, after there were a bunch of letters, and then they rewrote the article and they put my name in it. Welcome to Toronto, it's how history plays out. So anyway, when we got back from the march, the group, Toronto Gay Action, that had orchestrated the demonstration or march, whatever you want to call it, what are we going to do now? We didn't, what's our focus now? And it was at a meeting, I think it was held at the offices of Guerrilla magazine, which was the sort of counterculture magazine, general counterculture magazine at the time. I had the idea to start a gay magazine, the Body Politic. And so everyone went with the idea, and they thought it was the best thing we could do with our energy was to start a gay journal, use it as an organizing tool, to reach out and build a social movement. So that's how the Body Politic happened. Backing up my early days as a bookseller, I said I started buying books, called it Glad Day Bookshop. That was after William Blake, a painting of William Blake, Glad Day. It shows a nude male dancing in spectral colors of the rainbow, and supposedly was inspired by a prison break where the man was liberated. And so that was why I chose the name Glad Day. And so I took all these books that I was acquiring and put them in a backpack and went around on my bicycle from one meeting to another and laid them out on a table and sold a few books. And I also had a little mimeographed mail order catalog, which I advertised in Tab. Tab was a kind of sleaze rag in Toronto at the time. But that's where you saw little gay stories once in a while. And I ran a classified in there, and people ordered the catalog. And so that were the origins of things.
Okay, that's really interesting.
No, there's a lot more than that.
Oh, I can
We're
imagine.
just starting.
It's like you're just hitting peaks.
Well,
of
yeah,
stuff,
I mean, because the Body Politic and Glad Day were together for the first few years in 3 different homes that I occupied. The movement was my house, where I was living, right? It was only in the year 4 that the Body Politic moved out of, was Seton Street in Cabbagetown, at 139 Seton Street. And then eventually, Glad Day, I found my first space on Yonge Street to move the bookstore to. I don't know, 74 maybe, I think 74. So, and then I was involved in Gay Alliance toward equality. I went to hundreds of meetings and all that sort of thing. But the people involved in TGA and the Body Politic were people who had a greater vision than just gay civil rights. Okay, so we distilled all the grievances against the government into this We Demand document. Okay, but that was just one dimension and it wasn't it wasn't more important than any other aspect of gay liberation as we saw it. We were really interested in changing the way people thought about sexuality, the way they behaved, just opening the society up to totally different possibilities. We were completely opposed to gay marriage, for example, even though theoretically, people should have the democratic right to do whatever they want, right? But you know, that all changed to the point where the radical roots of gay liberation have now been completely lost and forgotten. Toronto has a particular problem, even with gay pride. I mean, we had the first gay pride here in Toronto, I think in 1971, but I've never seen it referred to in the gay press or the straight press or anywhere. People choose different years. Most of them seem to choose the year when the day was officially recognized by the bureaucracy, by the government. You know, as if all those years, 10 or 15 years before that, weren't important. In fact, they were far more important because, you know, that's when we were all on our own, sticking our necks out, right? But gay Toronto, you know, history seems, you know, you explain it to me. You know, it's really sad. But I think in basic gay history, I mean, I was a bookseller for 30 years, so I know every book that came out, every book. And most large cities have had more substantial history projects, books written about them, you know, whatever, Philadelphia, New York, San Francisco, Los Angeles, you know, London, Paris. They've all had history books written about the gay culture. But Toronto, you know, where is it? You know, I think that'll change. I hope that'll change now. But you know, another example. Okay, let's go back again. Wasn't the last project. It was the last project I think I initiated in Toronto here. Was the Canadian Lesbian and Gay Archives. Okay, newsletter #1 of the archives credits me with founding the archive. Does anybody give me any credit for it? No, nothing. Okay, a few months ago, I was nominated to this photo project along with Sky Gilbert and Nancy Nicole.
National Portraits.
The National Portrait Collection. Okay, you know. And I didn't go to the ceremony. I chose not to go to the ceremony because, well, I'd had a long discussion with them about whether they were going to use a photograph or use an artistic rendition. Well, I said, well, I'm a photographer. I'd like to see a photo of myself, and I have a few. I don't have very many, but I have a couple of me during the peak of my activist period, and I think that would be really appropriate to use. They didn't like that. So I said, okay, do whatever you wish. So they had an artist, somebody I've known for 30 or 40 years. You know, he did a watercolor. It was okay. Nothing, you know, it was okay. I accepted it. And then as it got close to the time for the induction ceremony, I tried to communicate with them about how they were going to describe my life and my contributions, like why was I being given this award. And there were two sentences. Okay, two sentences. The two sentences said that I belonged to various gay organizations. That's all they said. No reference to that I had founded anything, no reference to the fact that I had an international career, both in the United States and Canada, as a gay liberationist. No reference to the fact that I spent 30 years of my life as a gay bookseller. I'm the oldest living gay bookseller in the world. That's because Glad Day's the oldest surviving bookstore. None of that, you know, was even in their written description. This is the archive, you know. So I wrote back. I said, I don't recognize the person that, you know. And I wrote two sentences of my own, which very precisely, you know, distilled what I thought was important to say about my life in relation to the movement, and I sent it to them, and I've never heard from them ever since. You know, it's, you know, Toronto.
I'm going to draw from
Yeah.
a lot of what you just shared. Just a technical thing for a moment. I recognize that we didn't mention that, and I don't know how this is going from your perspective, that most interviewers look at me when they're talking
That's
about.
okay.
Has
I
it
mean,
been okay?
It is somewhat anyways.
Where am I
Okay,
looking at
that's
you
good.
mostly? At the light?
No.
At me, so you converse with me.
You haven't really looked at me very often.
No.
Yeah,
anyways,
okay, I
but
just didn't know. I just, but that's
You
normal.
don't have to keep fixed.
Yeah,
Don't
feel free
like
to move your head around, whatever, but mostly you're talking to me.
generally, yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
And it gives a good angle for the camera
It's
as
just
well.
because it's not a great angle to look right at the camera because that's not really the kind of thing we're looking for.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, but feel free to just, I just wanted to
But,
check
you know,
with that.
yeah. You're
But,
fine. You've been fine, it's been good.
your history's amazing. You know, let me just share this with you for a second because you did ask me at the beginning how much I knew about you, that I know bits about you because your name has come up repeatedly in my 25 in activism from the 80s, right?
Yeah.
And that's partly because, you know, I have a lot of praise for people I learned my stuff from within Seattle, and they always had a respect for history, and they always had a respect for who was there and who was doing what. So your stories now are coming through, and I'm thinking, oh right, yes, you know, because your name has come up repeatedly, at least in Seattle circles.
Yeah.
And so I'm just coming to one of the questions here. You've been touching about your work in queer liberation, and just what you just said there was just a key piece. I'm picturing you as a young guy with your knapsack, pulling books out, putting them on tables, urging people to look at them, buy them, without a shop, right? What a contribution to liberationism right then and there. I mean, you got people reading stuff and getting their minds around things.
Well, yeah, reading was central to my coming out, my acceptance of myself as a gay person, but far beyond that, it helped me understand how we got to be where we're at, culturally, how we got to be a sex-negative, anti-homosexual society. You know, that was the big question for me, and you know, I struggled through reading to understand that, and because you have to understand that if you're going to try and liberate the culture from you know, this incredible bind that it's got itself into. So I mean, that was really the motivation for me. Oh yeah, okay, I want equal rights here and there and everything. Of course. But you know, we really hoped we could change the whole complexion of society, and of course we utterly failed. In fact, more than failed. I mean, I think things are in most ways around sexuality far worse than they were before the beginning of the gay liberation movement. Things are polarized. Like in identity politics, you have to identify as gay. Well, if you know Kinsey describes a culture where a large percentage, I don't remember, it was 30 or 40 or more, of the population, of males at least, engaged in a lot of homosexual conduct to the point of orgasm, that's how he defined it. And incidental homosexuality. They didn't have to take on an identity. It was just something they enjoyed and did in the course of their life, you know, and I think a lot of that has been lost. You know, now you either have to, you know, sign on as gay or so in a way I think it's a more polarized world. And of course the big event, the emergence of AIDS, utterly destroyed everything that we had achieved up to that point, in my opinion. I mean, I think the movement failed to, people like myself failed to give it more of an ideological grounding, you know, I think we're just riding along and enjoying life, you know, this really fantastic era to live in the late 70s up through, you know, the real moment when the AIDS thing became the dominant fact of our lives. So.
Can I just,
Yeah.
I just want to go back, and I definitely want to come back to what you see as the failures of the movement, but when you said that's what you needed, that reading, that learning to understand all of this, my sense is you succeeded with a number of people as well. You went from putting up books on tables at meetings, where I'm guessing people were picking them up, they were buying them, what have you, to the point of opening up a shop.
And we're opening up 2 shops.
Two shops,
Yeah,
right, Boston and Toronto, and,
Yeah.
and people are actually purchasing these things to the point that you can keep these businesses running. Did that contribute? Did people's thinking, did that contribute to people in terms of how they either self-identified or how the movement identified itself, what its priorities were going to be, how they saw the world?
Yeah, I mean, I would like to think, and I know for sure, that my work as a bookseller was important to hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands of people in developing their consciousness. I mean, as well, I mean, I saw it as, I mean, I was a real firebrand of gay liberation, and it was my entire life, day and night, right? It was in my house, right? It was, and I even saw it as my duty to bring people out. I brought out hundreds of people. They had their first gay experiences with me because I was very good at it. Well, by that I mean not only at the sex, but I was good at trying to get them to understand, to think about what was going on, you know, to analyze their own lives and to develop their consciousness. And now I don't know whether that happens anymore at all. I mean, the younger generation, I don't know. I mean, who knows? But it seems like the closet is back in a big way. I mean, I wrote to someone the other day and having a party at my house, and I said, well, come on to the party. You know, you might meet a new lover or a sex buddy or something like that. And he said, well, you know, that's passé. You know, we meet on the internet, right? And okay, yeah, that's true, but you know, the internet also keeps people from developing a consciousness, and it encourages people to lie to themselves and to other people. So I think it's a frightening dynamic, a really you know, I mean, I've tried using the internet myself. Of course, I'm an older person. For someone as old as myself, it's pretty hopeless. But you know, I just got really tired of all the deceptions that people get involved in that kind of communication. So I think it's really tragic that people just you know, don't meet on the street the way they used to. I mean, St. Joseph Street here, a few blocks from where we are, before this Church Street, on a warm summer evening, you could see a couple of hundred young guys and older guys just leaning against trees, chatting with each other, you know, moving from one group to the other. And I like that a lot, you know, because there the person is in front of you. You know, you're meeting them. It's not just a sexual thing. You know, you have it's a real, and there's no money involved, there's no capitalism, you don't have to buy anything, you know. So then that all seems to be gone now. Everything, in fact, the early Body Politic, do you know the origin of extra? Mm-hmm. Extra was the shit that we didn't want to put in the Body Politic because we thought it compromised our vision. Right, it was all, and we were afraid that the advertisers would start to control the editorial content of the paper, right? So, but we still wanted the money from the ads, right? And we also were trying to, the Body Politic had grown in those first few years into a journal that was respected and read internationally, which is extremely rare for anything from Canada to have achieved that status. That's what I, you know, excited me the most about Body Politic was that it had achieved that status. And so that also meant that the Body Politic couldn't do a lot of Toronto news. That was another reason for starting Extra. Because if the Body Politic was being read international, then it had to have more international articles of interest to a larger readership, not to just a local readership. So, but then of course, it was declared financially inviable at a certain point and killed off, and Extra went marching on to create the sex phone lines and all the things that we wanted no part of in those days, right? Because we realized we wanted sex to be free. We didn't want, you have to pay or to buy a product or, to sign up for anything. That was the whole emphasis.
So on that point, I'm going to just go with what you're saying here. So it proved to be a real challenge to keep the Body Politic alive then, because it's almost like this encroaching capitalism that, to keep those pages printed, you needed those ads, and yet you were not prepared to compromise, right? Because
I don't know. You see, I had been eliminated long before then, so I don't know what was going on inside. All I knew is I read every issue of the paper, from cover to cover for its whole life. The only thing I saw was people coming and going, suddenly they're gone. Myself with writers, you get to know a person through their writing, through their articles, and you get to have a feeling, a connection with them, and you care about them, and then suddenly they're gone, Why are they gone? Something happened, right? And this happened hundreds of times. Or I would feel, oh my God, this person is being worked to death. Every article is written by them. And how much are they being paid, I wonder. But then they're gone, right? They've been bled. And so then the next one came along or whatever, But what was really going on, I don't know. But I was involved as a capitalist, as a bookseller, and so I had some sense of the economic dynamic of how to keep. And some people consider me the founder of the Body Politic, so I have some sense of whether it was viable or not, And anyway, it's that's the way history went. But I think it's pivotal. Because it was a turning point in sort of the loss of that radical spirit, right? And that didn't have much. I think that happened. I don't know what year that happened. Do you know what year the Body Politic ceased publication?
Yes, 1986.
It kept going till '86.
The fall, I think, of '86.
Yeah.
And how right you were about how internationally respected it was. I was a graduate student in New York City, and it made but there was the cover picture story of the New York native, where they actually took the last image of the Body Politic and transposed it on their cover, and said the demise of the Body Politic, and it was the story of the. And I thought, that's a Canadian paper, and this is getting big news.
Yeah. Maybe the Body Politic had to throw in the towel, but I remember thinking at the time, well, there should be community meetings about this. Because it was so important in everything that happened here, that if there was any way of keeping it going or redefining it, and it was supposed to always belong to the community. In those days, it was the collective, right? It was the collective up until it became Extra. Then it had. See, we believed in this horizontal power structure, right? And myself, I was never a power queen. I was a pleasure queen. And those are the two roads. And maybe that one of my big mistakes. I could have been a power queen on a lot of levels, but I really was never interested in it. And but we had this idea of democracy through a horizontal power structure, which is why we had the collective to begin with. And and the idea there was that we, the collective, produce the paper, but the paper belongs to the community. So then when I saw individuals making decisions about the body politic, I thought to myself, well, the community should have a chance to get involved, and maybe you know, because it threw away so much. It not only threw away the radical spirit, it threw away this internationally recognized journal. You know, so anyway, it's you know.
It's an interesting tool also, it sounds like, in terms of informing and shaping the community, the movement, for that matter.
Well, that's what it did, yeah.
And okay, if I say this to you, and this is just from my own perspective, I picked up the Body Politic in its latter years, because that's when I was just coming into my coming out and trying to grapple and find where do I find my supports, and I found this paper, and then went off and did graduate studies, and then it died. But what I was reading in those pages was really thought-provoking. It was deep stuff. It wasn't, like you said, it wasn't extra. Like, this was very different, and I'm just curious, what's your take on that in terms of the people who wrote, the contributors, the people who read it? What was its, how would you describe its role in the movement in defining liberation?
Well, I don't know, you know, I know that everybody read it. Everybody read it. I mean, we used to, in the first year or two, we sold it out on the street corners. I would stand, Jearld Moldenhauer or myself or some of the other people, we would have a bundle of 100 papers, it was $0.25, and we'd sell them out in an hour or two, right? And then when I ran the Glad Day bookshop, we used to get 300 or 400, at least 300 or 400, and we'd sell them all out, right? So a lot of people were uncomfortable with the radicalism of some of the articles in the Body Politic, but everybody had to read it, right? And so I think, you know, I think it did have a tremendous effect on shaping the culture of the 70s and the 80s in Toronto. But once it ceased publication, and once the AIDS epidemic started to really grow, I think these cultural phenomena come and go. They just, you know, like, I don't really think there's a gay movement anymore, right? I sometimes even wonder if there's a gay community anymore. I mean, seriously. You know, because what defines a movement? What defines a community? Yeah, I mean, you know, I have some ideas of my own about that. But what was important, like to the movement, was trying to really change the society. And I don't see a whole lot of that happening anymore. You know, a few tweaking of the dials here or there, but you know, and the attitudes. I mean, the laws are changed. I mean, we have this equity situation, but I don't think there is any equality. I don't really believe in equality, I guess. But I do believe in equity. I do believe in at least having the same rules for everybody, right? But I think the prejudices in every society are so deep around religion, around sex. Well, they're connected, you know, and this differences of social class, which are the most extreme of all. You know, I don't think you can ever shed those. I mean, maybe you can aspire to them, to some kind of equality, but I don't ever think it's going to exist.
Yes. Can I ask you to elaborate on, you made a statement, I don't believe in equality. Could you just maybe elaborate on that?
Well, I believe in it. Yeah, I believe in it as maybe as some kind of vision, but it's a vision that could only be realized if the roots of prejudice were eliminated in society. And I see religion as one of the primary roots of prejudice, for example. And you'd have to alter totally the educational system, you know. I mean, just as starters, you know.
Mm-hmm. There's a couple places I can go with this. So with what you were just saying, I've got a few thoughts going through my mind. Did you want to talk maybe a bit about the difference between equity and equality, just on that point?
Well, I mean, I don't have a lot to say except that that I've already said it. I think that you know, people who identify as a minority can struggle toward a situation of equity, but you know, how do you achieve equality? How do you take it to the next step? And can you? Like, I don't know. See, I think like around sexuality, that different races, different cultures have different sexualities. I mean, there's multiple homosexualities. We used to talk about homosexuality not as homosexuality, but as homosexualities. Right now, certain homosexualities are completely sidelined or shunned, or you know. I mean, I think even Oscar Wilde would be arrested today, you know, by the gay movement. They wouldn't have to wait for the police. But with globalization and the rise of the corporate world and dominating everything, it seems like we appreciate difference less and less. And we don't seek to understand people who are different or cultures who are different. We just bulldoze over them one way or the other. And so unless you're keenly interested in understanding where people are coming from and getting your head around those differences, how can you ever even aspire to equality unless it's just complete whitewash, which I think it is, you know. So, I mean, the gay community is maybe particularly strange. How do you say this? There's so many different things to say. Sex itself is a very, I think probably you could say it's a very selfish drive, you know. Although people can experience it in different ways. I mean, they can be totally narcissistic, or what's the opposite of, or they can look for the other. You know, myself, I'm always interested in difference in the other. I find that really interesting, but I think that the dominant characteristic in the gay male community, I don't speak for women, is very narcissistic, and I think the superficial, the gay life, as I see it, the gay culture, as it is now, is so incredibly superficial that, you know, it just feeds into this selfish machine of these institutions that define gay social life these days. But, you know, for me, there's just nothing in it, and I think that's part of the reason why I've left Canada. You know, I couldn't live in the United States. That's where I'm from. I enjoy being here. I enjoy being in the United States, but for a very short period of time. And I almost feel the same way about Europe. Everything has become so middle class. that it crushes everything in its path, you know, and everything is the same, you know, and so I'm living in the third world. That's what's where I feel more comfortable, ultimately, and you know, I don't understand everything about the culture I live in, but you know, I'm working on it anyway. So that's just my life, you know. So,
Jearld, there's another thing. One of the critiques around what's happened to the movement, if it exists or not right now, and I know you're questioning that, is, I'll use my own words. I sometimes get frustrated because I say that there are organizations and so-called activists out there who are not willing to take up the harder work. And the harder work is, like what you were saying, is actually trying to change society.
yeah, but
rather than taking the easier path of saying, how do we get society to accept us? You know, when you were saying everyone's the same, that's the assimilationist kind of direction the movement has gone
it's
in.
totally assimilationist, and there's almost no gay press anymore. Gay bookstores have been dying like flies. There's almost, so this whole cultural renaissance period, or whatever you want to, however you want to refer to it, when people were at least writing and reading, is slowed down considerably. You know, almost to the point, I mean, Glad Day will probably close any day now. I mean, I don't know. I go in there and I don't see anybody in there. Customers, I mean, you know, so I don't know how they can keep going. So if people aren't engaged with the ideas anymore, there's no challenging, really challenging media. I mean, Extra does have some good things. I read it as every day, you know, looking for something interesting. You know, but of course I read 20 different newspapers a day, looking for something. But anyway, but the composition of the society has changed so that. So I don't think there really is a movement, and I already said I think a movement has to be primarily, the thrust of the movement has to come from a younger generation, not from older people. I mean, they're the ones who sit back and write, you know, their theories or their history books or whatever. But any real change has to come from youth, and I don't see it happening at all. Do you see it happening? I mean, you seem to believe that there is some movement out there.
There is some. I mean, Career Ontario is an example. I'm not trying to heighten it because of my role in it or whatever, but I have to say, when I try to keep a liberationist voice out there, when CL decided to dissolve, it was out of a bit of desperation. I was worried that there isn't going to be a progressive voice an organized progressive voice in this province anymore, unless, you know, something happens. So it was the last kick of the can. I put it out there, and I have to say I'm surprised that it actually attracted people, and the people that came out and have stuck with it and are contributing, like Davina and many others, are really.
Are there young people?
Some
how,
young.
How many young people?
Some are
Just
young.
a few, or what?
I think of the active members, a good handful.
A handful.
A good. I mean, of our active members, we have about a dozen to 15 to 20 that keep things going. We've got, you know, in the hundreds of people who are following our work. And of them, there's quite a number that are young. I mean, they tease me constantly about being older, so that tells me they're younger.
Yeah.
There's Casey, AJ, they're all
quite young.
late 20s.
Martin.
Yeah,
I mean,
I'm not old.
Yeah. None of us are old, but they remind me how old I am. So
Yeah.
So I guess my point is, there is a group of very dissatisfied, progressive thinking young people who are not impressed with what's happening in the institutions out there, be it bars, be it Pride, be it the corporatization, the capitalism. And they are really quite turned off and angry about it, and saying, this is not, you know, and they'll use terms like, in 2011 they'll say, this is why I say I'm queer, as opposed to that mainstreaming gay thing where they're running off and getting married. They're very frustrated by this, and they needed an outlet. And it seems.
But
to
are
be-
they, wait a minute, are they the people who have already been rejected by the mainstream, or are they rejecting the mainstream? Which is it? I mean,
My sense, I don't want to speak for everyone, but my sense is that they are rejecting the mainstream. They're not impressed with what's happening in the
Oh,
mainstream.
yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Definitely.
mm,
No, the mainstream really hasn't had a chance to reject me because they haven't done anything, or I believe some of them haven't really come out fantastically so that they could get that kind of rejection. But
mm.
they're already immediately.
But they pick up the vibes, you pick up the vibes that this culture is you know, assimilationist, middle class, boring, etc. And so you can, it's obvious, so you don't associate with it if your brain is functioning and you have another vision. So I don't know.
And so I guess what I'm getting at with that is, it wasn't to tout Ontario per se, but it is to say that, you know, if there's any kind of movement out there, there has been, like over the years you've seen, there's been, like you mentioned it a little earlier, but there's been this heavy focus on civil rights, changing the laws, being recognized to the same level as heterosexuals in essence. It is that kind of, you know, and some of them were really under the belief that they were going to be respected because we gained these rights. And others of us who say, well, yeah, we got the rights as part of the process, but are we any more respected today?
Well, I mean, the main area where one looks is in the school system, right? And you see the alienation of gay youth is might well be worse than it was 30 years ago. I don't know. I mean, just from the stories I read and the statistics on suicide, and I mean, you know, like, it doesn't seem like there's any, that's where you measure the depth of the success in that kind of environment, and it shows how shallow it is, right? That's what I would say.
You're right, and that's one of the big things that Career Ontario is actually underway is with the school system.
Yeah, but I don't know what your strategy is, but you know, because I'm not here, I won't be able to go to your meetings here.
Yeah. Were you aware? You must have been. What you read a lot, you're well read. So that whole campaign that came out of the U.S. It Gets Better. You heard of that?
What is it?
It Gets Better.
Oh, the It Gets Better thing. Yeah, no,
Yeah.
that was gross. Yeah.
So you want to elaborate on that?
Yeah.
Like, you know, as an example of you know what they
That was
thought.
Dan Savage, was it?
Yes.
Oh,
yeah.
yeah.
That was around those that slew of suicides.
Right. Yeah. Well, I mean, I think. I mean, what's Dan saying there? Your skin just gets thicker or something, or you know, or you get pushed into this middle class closet. I mean, you can call it a closet, and so I don't know. You start to make you start to have the same accumulation of goods or something. So maybe that's what they mean by it gets better. I don't know. You know, I think it's a way of just saying the brainwashing hasn't completed its run yet, but we'll get there. You'll be crushed.
I'm bouncing a bit, but I want to go back to something earlier you said, because you were almost conjuring up an image in my head of what it must have been like earlier on when you said my house was where the liberation movement was happening, from availing books to people, where people were coming to meet and stuff. Could you just elaborate on that? Like, what was happening in that house?
Okay, that's a colorful part of the history. When I came back to Toronto from Berlin, I moved in with this gay couple up in the annex, Kendall Avenue, and that's where I started the little Glad Day newsletter and bookshop. And that's where the Body Politic, we decided to get rid of, or not meet at Gorilla, and so we needed a place to meet. So we met there. Plus, I don't think we did much layout in that apartment, because in fact we weren't there for very many months after that, because the two lovers had just bought a house on Kensington Avenue in the Kensington Market, 4 Kensington Avenue. One of the lovers was an artist from Italy, Amerigo Maras, and his lover Don was a draft dodger from Mississippi. And so we moved into the Kensington house, and it was in the Kensington house that the Body Politic and Glad Day and the Gay Alliance for Equality and the Toronto Gay Action had most of their activities. There was a shed, an unheated shed in the back of the house that was about the size of this room, I guess. And the owners of the house allowed us to utilize this space. So during the day, it was more or less the Glad Day bookshop. I put up these cheap little shelves, and there was only one copy of each book on the walls. And then in the evening, we had these layout boards that were on hinges, and we put legs up, and that's where we did the layout on the Body Politic with our old IBM typewriters. And but during the day, 4 Kensington Avenue saw lots of visitors. It was incredible how many hundreds of people found their way over from Yonge Street, because the gay life was centered pretty well on Yonge Street, you know, between College and Bloor then. And the gay community, a lot of gay people still lived in these condominiums and apartments around here. But hundreds of people would find their way, and it wasn't easy to find this house, because you had to go down a little alley into the back of the house to arrive at the shed. But you know, it was an incredible time, because people they wanted to plug in, they wanted to find out what was happening, you know, to be a part of it. But ironically, this is, well, maybe it's not irony, it's just the way it is. After issue 5 of the Body Politic was published, and Jearld Hannon's first piece on pedophilia was published, of men and little boys, all of the a columnist for the Toronto Sun wrote an article saying, you know, that we should, I guess basically that we should be arrested. And so this was picked up across Canada by all the newspapers, and they all wrote articles and editorialized calling for our arrest. And that August, most of the collective members weren't in Toronto. They had left to go wherever for their holidays, including Jearld Hannon. And so a few of us were left in the house when all the sparks were flying, just waiting for the police to come and take us away. But fortunately, they didn't. They waited until the second article. But what that did precipitate was that the gay couple that had allowed the movement to use this space in their house, the heat was too much for them, and so they threw me out, and by throwing me out, they threw out Glad Day, the Body Politic, and everything. So, and I had become friends with John Sides, not in a relationship, but we'd become friends. And John had been living in this house as well, because during the renovation they needed his skills. He has a lot of skills in anything related to construction. So they moved him in to utilize his skills, and then they decided to throw him out too when they threw me out. And so John at that time, I remember, he had a 1948 Packard. It looked more like a tank. And so we drove all around up and down the streets looking for sale signs on a house, because we didn't know what to do. We had to get out of there. And we decided to try and buy a house where the Body Politic and Glad Day could exist. And so we found a house that had, in Cabbagetown, which apparently had been a prostitution house or something. And so we bought it and moved in, rather quickly, and set up the bookstore in the hallway and the newspaper in the living room and everything else, and so it existed there for a couple of years, and there were hundreds of meetings in that house, and thousands of people coming and going all the time. I remember one of my customers was Crosby. Crosby, was he the Newfoundland Crosby? He was part of Mulroney's cabinet.
Oh,
You remember?
I know
well, his brother.
Right.
His brother was the Minister of Fisheries, and a limousine, one of these long limousines, would pull in front of 139 Seton Street, and this man would get out and come to look at books, right? And we would sit and have tea together, and he would ask me questions about the gay movement. He was keenly interested in the gay movement. It took me a long time to find out who he was, but eventually I was able to. And so that was the kind of thing, that I've outed him, I suppose, by saying this now. But he died a long time ago. Yeah, you never know who was going to come to the door. And trying to remember other people who stayed there. Andrew Hodges. Do you know who Andrew Hodges is? He wrote the biography of Alan Turing, the British scientist who is considered the inventor of the first computer. Well, yeah, Andrew Hodges stayed in that house while he was doing research on that biography for quite a while. And at any rate, then one day John Size decided to sell his half of the house to buy another house and leave. This is too much detail. And at the same time, around 1979, I started my second bookstore in Boston in February of '79. And it wasn't too long thereafter that the censorship in Canada escalated. I think it was in '82 or something like that. I get my chronology wrong, but everything's written down. So I was trying to run the two bookstores and run this house, and I was having great difficulty. And so eventually I moved out of the house, and I rented it to another gay collective. See, in those days, the radicals, we weren't in coupledoms. We were in collectives, right? Like all during that period, we lived in these communal situations. And my house was the first of the communes. And then there were the rest of the Body Politic collective, people like Hannon and Jackson and Herb Spires and Paul MacDonald. They lived in another collective house. And then the third collective house consisted of George Smith, who was the mastermind behind the community response to the bath raids. He was a professor of sociology at Boise. George, he died of AIDS in the 90s, I believe. But Tim McCaskill, Glenn Wheeler, those were the people who constituted the other house. And David Gibson, who moved to New York and got involved in a relationship with Jonathan Katz, which I think is still goes on today. So that was the third house. They were also on Seton Street, just up the block from us. So there was a lot of interaction. But then eventually they moved into my house because I moved out and moved into an apartment because I just was going crazy trying to manage a collective house and two bookstores in two different countries. So.
How fascinating that whole kind of setup in terms of these houses and these collectives.
Yeah, and the original Seton Street was organized where we each made dinner one night a week, and it was on a schedule, you know, and we always had guests. There were always guests staying at the house or sharing dinner or one thing or the other. You know, it was a real community. If you know, that's as much a community as I've ever known. So, I suppose I should talk about the censorship period too a bit. You know, Mulroney, when he became Prime Minister, I assume because of his own Catholic Irish background, and maybe because he hadn't accepted his, supposedly Mulroney's brother is gay, I don't know. You know the story there? No, okay, I don't. But anyway, Mulroney had this fixation in his mind to somehow stifle the growth of this gay movement, and he masterminded this internal memorandum to give to the Canada Customs to basically to make it illegal to bring anything that discussed homosexuality or showed pictures or anything into the country. When we first saw the memorandum, we all just looked at it and, no, this is not possible. This is a joke, you know. But we were frightened because we realized what it could mean, and he intended it to stop the flow of gay newspapers, gay magazines, gay everything into Canada, right? And long before Little Sisters got caught up in this, Glad Day was the primary target for a few years. And so the first 6 months when this happened, I remember we had something like $10,000 worth of material seized at the border, which was never returned to the vendor or to the source or to us, and we were stuck with the bill. That was the way they were going to put us out of business, right? And so my young manager, James McPhee, who died of AIDS, there's a little plaque in this park here. There was a tree, but the city cut down the tree to memory of James. James and I decided we had to fight back, and so we orchestrated a strategy around the joy of gay sex. We chose the joy of gay sex because it dealt with sex, and Mulroney had used it as a kind of cornerstone of his campaign. He some little old lady in Winnipeg or something bought a joy of gay sex, and she thought it was the joy of cooking. That's the story, right? And so,
what a surprise!
And so that was what's supposed to have triggered the government sending the Canadian publisher representative of the Joy of Gay Sex, I think it was Simon & Schuster, a note saying, we suggest you remove the Joy of Gay Sex from your distribution list. And so the publisher went along with it passively. Rather than standing up for freedom of speech, they sent all the booksellers, of which of course I was one, a letter saying, please remove the Joy of Gay Sex from your shelves, right, and return them to us because it's illegal now to sell this, you know, it's been declared obscene. And so we resisted, we refused to do it. And, but the only way you could challenge the government was to have the book personally seized coming into your bookstore from outside the country. So we had a hard time actually orchestrating the seizure. But we were able to accomplish it. And with that, we received our seizure notice, and with that we could appeal it, and once we had that, then we could take it to the court, which is what we did. And, but meanwhile, the government became more and more furious with the fact that we were trying to fight back. And so they were seizing everything they could to try and destroy us utterly. And there was almost no problem in Quebec from l'Inde regime, because the French Canadian have a different mentality around sex. That's one of the divides. And Little Sisters wasn't selling that much in those days. I mean, they eventually, Little Sister, I don't know the history of Little Sisters exactly, but they went through stages. We all went through stages of growing and evolving, and but for at least the first couple of years, it was pretty well glad day at the center of the seizures. Now, here goes. I feel that Extra never gave Glad Day the support that it needed to make this fight against censorship a major national issue for the gay movement. And that has a lot to do with perhaps a personal relationship between the editor and myself, or the publisher and myself. We essentially felt abandoned. We would send them seizure notices and expected somebody would cover it because it was escalating, and we could see where it was headed. You know, this was very dangerous, and occasionally there was a token piece in Extra, but instead of understanding that this issue of censorship is a central issue in the lives of gay people that needs to be understood and by the entire community, and to develop their consciousness around this so that we would fight this all together, basically we felt totally abandoned. And that was really demoralizing for me, and one of the reasons why I sold the store in 1979. Because I was running the two stores, and I mean, there was support from elements in the community, but there could have been so much more. And of course it didn't continue. The censorship went on for another decade. Now when Little Sisters had the BC Civil Liberties Union to back them up, all very progressive leftist, you know, lawyers, at least the ones I met. And so because of the existence of the BC Civil Liberties Union and their interest in the issue, Little Sisters was able to build and orchestrate its fight against Canada Customs. The Canadian Civil Liberties Union here in Toronto, which I belong to today, wasn't interested in the issue. Another question. In fact, the Canadian Booksellers Association, which is a professional association of booksellers to which I belonged, when we announced that we were going to fight the government on the joy of gay sex and we wanted their support, they absolutely refused to give support. In writing, they said, no, we won't support you. Serge Lavoie, he was the president of the Canadian Booksellers Association at the time. Everyone just buckled under to this censorship mentality. And now the Canadian Booksellers Association finally came on board after a change of president or director or executive director. There was I can't remember her name, but she called me and said, I'm really sorry about all this history and everything, you know, we understand the issues now. But that was a long, long, hard road. I mean, trying to get support. Finally, like I had a confrontation with Margaret Atwood in a Boston bookstore. I went, it was the only place I could find her, catch her. She was there for a signing, and I had pictures of it and everything. I said, you know, you have to do more. You have to raise these issues in Canada, you know, because, you know, they're trying to destroy us utterly, you know. And she did become more vocal, as did Timothy Findlay. He became very, very vocal. So finally, you know, but the gay press, it's something for a historical researcher to see if I'm exaggerating or not.
Mm-hmm. And in addition to the gay press, Extra in particular, what's your sense of, because you said there were segments of the movement or the community that did support us,
Yeah.
and yet others that didn't. What's your sense even beyond Extra? I realize that's a very touchy point with Extra, but even beyond that, did groups get behind this? Did people say this is a real problem?
Well, no, we formed our own there were two anti-censorship organizations, but they were initiated by the Glad Day Bookshop. The first one was called Canadian Committee Against Censorship, Custom Censorship, I think. And then the last one was called Censor Stop. Yeah, and we have buttons and, you know, our banners and everything. I have pictures of our demonstrations. But, you know, it was people like Chris Burchill or Gary Kinsman, you know, sort of the left-wing leaders in the community who rallied around, and some of our customers, of course, who understood the issues, you know. But it was a real mishmash, I think, and I mean, some of the demonstrations we had, we got, you know, 60 or 70 people, maybe 100, maybe at the most, something like that. But they were important because they got picked up by the. We realized we couldn't depend on Extra for coverage, but there was an increasing consciousness in whatever it was at the time, Now or I, or, you know, so and you know, occasional CBC or something else. So yeah. So, but meanwhile, in the United States, you know, where I'm from, and the source of most of the literature, like 80% of gay books and publications come from the United States. I was basically, after an initial stumbling block, that is being burnt down to the ground, in 1980. The store was started in 1979. In 1982, an arsonist torched the building housing Fag Rag, which was a radical gay men's magazine. In the beginning, there were 3 radical gay magazines in the movement: Fag Rag in Boston, Gay Sunshine in San Francisco, and the Body Politic here in Toronto. We saw each other as linked, as the radical face of the gay movement. So anyway, Fag Rag and a newspaper called Gay Community News, which was a weekly newspaper run by a group of left-wing lesbians and men in the almost equal basis, as certainly the best experiment of that kind ever in the history of the gay and lesbian movement, existed in the same building, and that's why it was torched. It took a year or two for the federal investigators to find out who torched the building, and it was some police or firemen who had actually torched it, because of course they knew how to do it. And so my store, I was in Europe at the time. I was sitting in Les Mots à la Bouche having a coffee when the phone rang, and someone in New York was assigned to try and find me, and told me that my store had been burnt to the ground. And I was supposed to meet my lover, who was a musician in England, a week later in Paris, and we were going to spend a month in Paris together. And so that was the end of that. And it was very, very difficult next several months. I went back after I was in denial for more than a week. And I went back, and of course everything was destroyed. And so I had no employees, I had a small insurance policy, $30,000 I remember. And so it was enough to pay off my debts, and I found another space, and I worked alone for the first 6 or 8 months, and got the thing back up on its feet, and from there just sailed forward, and we moved the store to a third place. I really lucked out in Boston. I had a wonderful space, almost 3 times the size of this Glad Day, right at Copley Square, across from the Carnegie Public Library. Best possible location, and and no government interference, no customs seizing your material. So for more than a decade, for 15, 20 years, I was able to realized my potential as a bookseller, trying to build my community. And that was an incredible experience. Whereas here I had fantasized about doing the same thing and about buying my own building, which is what every small business person dreams of doing, of controlling your own space, right, in order to survive. Because that's what happens. If you're successful small business renting, your landlord realizes that and raises the rent to basically drive you out and to get the next guy to move in, right? And that's the story of Church Street as far as I can see. But because of Canada Customs, I was never able to realize that dream here in Toronto. And I tried in Boston, but in the year 2000, I was trying to negotiate with my landlord to buy 2 floors of the building as a commercial condo. And he came to me and told me he'd sold the building. And so we had a couple months to get out. We had 4 months. And we looked around, and the first thing we saw was that, dozens, 50, 100 or more independent bookstores that had been there when I first started. And Boston was like the most interesting book city in North America. They had gone. They were all gone. There were just Starbucks and restaurants. And so we desperately tried to find a space that we could afford. And I paid lawyers to do negotiations and everything else. And after 4 months, I realized the writing was on the wall. And it was time to close the door. So I did, And so I spent 30 years in total as a gay bookseller, and that was how it ended in the year 2000. So, end of story.
Interesting, and just towards ending this interview, because the whole piece around censorship was you did a lot of work in that area, and it's got me thinking about, my limited exposure to it was when Seattle did what little it could to support Glad Day as well in those times. And wondering why are there not other groups stepping forward as well, and then learning, I was much younger and stuff, how controversial the issue of censorship is.
Well, I think part of the problem, and that's where I think the responsibility of Extra lie, is that nobody understood how it operated, how their system operated. In fact, a lot of Canadians, I would say even the majority, thought they had the same basic rights that Americans have, the First Amendment to the Constitution. They were confused, totally confused about how this Charter of Rights, what it meant. Basically, there was no case law, and so it really meant nothing. They were empty words. You have your words. They have to be defined in a court, right? I guess by lots of cases or something like that. So that I think is why Mulroney was able to get away with what he was able to get away with for so long. And so the education process, plenty of Canadians coming through, gay Canadians, have their videos seized or their books at the airport. I would say thousands and thousands. And they used every trick they could, like there were all these gay glossy magazines that were just nudie magazines, like Mandate and Play Guy and all those, maybe you remember them, In Touch. Instead of seizing them at the border because they wanted to look good, the customs, they invented 2 systems of dealing with the magazines. One was, 3 systems. The first was tearing out pages. They would take the entire stock and tear out a page of a cock or something that they didn't like, or an ass. And so this is a funny story. I actually talked to the distributor for all these magazines around Toronto, big distributor, and I chatted up this woman, and I said, how can you afford to do that? It's not much money involved, but it's very, very expensive to open up a magazine, find a page and tear it out, and thousands of magazines. She said, oh, well, we have the junior hockey team doing it. The junior hockey team? Yes, boys about 15 or 16 years old who are making money for their team by tearing out pictures of cocks. I think she regretted telling me that, but that makes perfect sense. That's how they could get cheap labor, right? And then later they invented the black dot that was put into in the printing process. The print run for Canada would have the black dot, and the black dot was hilarious. It was just a harassment thing. This cock would have a black dot, that one wouldn't. This ass would have a dot, that one wouldn't. It made absolutely no sense. I mean, we would laugh and cry at each time, but basically this was to drive them out of the country. And then finally there were two different editions. You get the Canadian edition, it was like half the size of the American edition. They just didn't print the pages anymore. There was nothing there. So the people would pick up this little magazine it was $4. You know, there's nothing inside. And so, of course, they wouldn't buy it, right, unless they were completely addicted, which most of them were. So anyway, they just, you know, did everything they could. So and this whole thing, I think, would have come to a head much quicker. When Little Sisters got involved in their court case, Extra was really on top of it. They repeated things over and over again. You could see they were doing their best to support them and educate the community about the issues, right? But that didn't help us, you know. So that's part of the history of Toronto, you know, sadly.
And it's part of the splits in the movement because, for example, some of the more radical liberationist type activists will not necessarily get all worked up around, for example, the idea of murder music, you know,
you mean just,
you know,
certain issues.
You know, and just saying that they're just true believers in freedom of speech, and yes, it's disturbing,
Yeah.
I'll acknowledge, that stuff is disturbing, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
But then there's others who just, without thinking that they're supporting censorship, will
Yeah.
just run forward, and they're part of our movement, our community.
Well, it never got to that stage, you know.
Right.
I mean, we're just talking about the simplest basic things. I mean, eventually they seized Margaret Atwood's books, or they didn't know the author, or Jane Rule. They didn't seize Margaret Atwood, but they seized Jane Rule's books. You know, she was an American but Canadian author in Nanaimo, but her books were published in the States, right? Sometimes they were simultaneously published here in the States. But finally they started seizing several Canadian authors' books who were published in the United States as well. You know, it's just completely out of control. These people, like, were given power and they abused their power. And we were hoping to demonstrate that and stop the entire process, that these people were not in a position to judge any of this material. In effect, I think that's what basically has happened. I mean, there are still some flashpoints I read about, but the government will never really come out and admit that it was wrong about anything, right? They'll make you suffer, and we suffered, believe me, psychologically and financially, you know, every day for years. And then finally they wake up and then, we have to change, you know, we really guess we should clean up our act. So they do that, but they never acknowledge it, they never apologize, and you're a complete crazy wreck by that time, and you've almost been bankrupt, you know, who cares, you know. So, I'm still laughing. You know.
Yeah, unfortunately. So, Jearld, we've had quite a conversation about a number of things, from just this issue of censorship to collective living and the whole, what you value around ideas, ideation, getting people to learn about these things and stuff in the movement in its early days. Is there anything you wanted to add before we close the interview? Anything that you didn't get a chance to say that you wanted to say?
There's thousands of things I could say. I feel that the interview was kind of like willy-nilly, and it could be a lot better structured. So keep that in mind if it's of use or if it makes sense. I mean, this could be a dry run or something, I don't know, or maybe you'll have enough there to work with. Probably you have enough to work with, but I'm not altogether happy with you know, the way it ran its course. Partly my fault, you know, because I wasn't maybe as prepared for it. But I think also you have to face the fact that there's a lot of territory, a lot of ground in my history, and it's hard to kind of, you know, squash it all into a small period. But you know, I mean, you know, the Gay Archive, they gave me 2 sentences, and they couldn't get those right, you know. So, but I tried to, and I managed. Anyway, all right, okay. So.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Okay. We're having a party at my house on